All right, in this unit, we're going to look at, first of all, the digestive system, which is the biggest part of the unit. And then the next chapter, chapter 18, is the nutrition chapter. And it's fairly minimal the way I cover it. So the big focus this is chapter 17. The good thing about the digestive system for you is that you're a little more familiar with it going into this than you are, say, lymphatic or endocrine systems. But just let me prepare you. There's a lot of terminology with the digestive system, and there's a lot of chemicals affecting the digestive system, like enzymes and hormones. So you'll want to, pay attention to that as we go through. But first of all, when we have digestion, of course, that's the breakdown of foods, but our digestive system is involved in more than just the breakdown. We take in the food, we break it down, and by breaking it down, that means change it into forms that are small enough to be absorbed into your body fluids, like your blood. And so another aspect of the digestive system, besides the breakdown, is the absorption of the nutrients from the food, and then the elimination of anything that you do not break down and do not absorb. Okay, and so when we talk about the breakdown, there's two types. There's a mechanical digestion and there's a chemical digestion. Mechanical digestion would be like if you ate steak. All right, if you had really lean steak, what food group are you getting? Protein. Okay, you know from A&P1 that proteins are huge molecules made up of individual molecules called amino acids, right? A protein molecule is too big to be absorbed through the wall of your digestive tract. Amino acids are small enough to be absorbed. Okay. The difference in mechanical and chemical digestion is when you eat that steak, when you break the meat into smaller pieces, but it's still the full-fledged protein molecules, that's mechanical digestion. But then when you break that protein into individual amino acids, so they're whole different molecules, that's chemical digestion. And the digestive system is involved in both. Okay. The organs of the digestive system can be lumped into two groups. One group is the alimentary canal, and these are the organs that the food actually passes through. So we'll see that as we go through this chapter. We'll start at the top and go to the bottom. But as we do, we'll be looking at some accessory organs that produce some fluids that empty into the digestive tract. And those organs are your salivary glands, your liver, your gallbladder, and your pancreas. So they produce or release fluids that aid in digestion. Okay, and those are the accessory organs. All right, and so if you look on this view, we can see all of the organs shown, and you're probably familiar with a lot of these, but I think I have a video that will go, yeah. Let's just look at it on the video instead of me repeating it. The same thing the video says. All right.
The primary functions of the digestive system are the breakdown of food, called digestion, and absorption of nutrients. Digestion begins in the mouth, where the teeth break food into smaller particles during mastication. Salivary glands located near the oral cavity secrete saliva, which begins chemical digestion and keeps the food moist. As food is swallowed, the soft palate blocks the upper pharynx to prevent food from entering the nasal cavity, and multiple voluntary muscles in the face, neck, and tongue contract, pushing food particles through the pharynx. The food passes over the epiglottis, which prevents food entry into the respiratory system, and then into the esophagus, which connects the pharynx to the stomach. The one-way movement of the food mass, now called a bolus, is controlled by wave-like involuntary muscle contractions. This movement is known as peristalsis. The bolus now enters the stomach. Folds in the stomach wall, called rugae, allow for expansion as the stomach fills. Stomach cells secrete hydrochloric acid, pepsinogen, and various regulatory hormones that chemically digest the bolus. Muscular contractions in the stomach churn its contents to further break down the bolus and mix it with stomach secretions to form a thick liquid called chyme. Chyme exits the stomach through the pyloric sphincter and enters the small intestine, the major site of nutrient absorption. The small intestine consists of three parts: the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Bile from the liver and digestive enzymes from the pancreas empty into the duodenum to aid in digestion. Absorbed nutrients pass from the lumen of the small intestine into blood and lymph. Chyme not absorbed in the small intestine enters the large intestine. As it passes through the cecum and ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid colon, water and salts are absorbed and chyme is converted into feces. The rectum stores feces until nervous stimulation initiates the defecation reflex, resulting in elimination through the anal canal.
Okay, so as we look at these organs of the alimentary canal, you're going to hear me use terms like mucosa and submucosa. And so those are the layers in the wall of most of these organs that your food passes through. And so before we start with the organs themselves and how they work, you need to understand the difference in these. The mucosa is just the part of it that lines each organ. Okay, so that's the inner surface. And the mucosa varies in each of these organs. Like it's different in the esophagus than it is the stomach and so forth. And that difference is determined by what happens at that organ. So we really will focus on the structure of the mucosa a lot as we look at these different organs. It may have glands in it. That's where the absorption takes place if it's an absorbing organ. Underneath the mucosa is mostly connective tissue and blood vessels. That's called the submucosa. There may be some glands associated with it. And so like on this picture, this is the small intestine. And so here you're seeing the four layers if you look at them more closely. Here's the mucosa. See, this one has a lot of projections on it. There's some little glands in there. Here's the submucosa. And then the muscularis mucosa. In most of the organs, there's two layers. There's a circular layer, and then there's a longitudinal layer. Okay, so you can have the organ getting smaller in diameter and shorter in length, and that helps with the movement and the mixing of the food as it passes through. And then the outer layer is the serosa, which, if it's an abdominal organ, that would be the same thing as the visceral peritoneum, the serosa. It's just the outer surface of the organ. Okay, so make sure you know those different layers. Okay, as food moves through the alimentary canal, as it goes from one organ to another, it's through the process of peristalsis. So food doesn't just drop down through the digestive tract. It's actually squeezed down by a wave of circular muscle contraction. Sort of like when you squeeze toothpaste out of a tube from the bottom to the top. It's a wave of contraction, and that's called peristalsis. You've already learned about sympathetic and parasympathetic impulses to the digestive tract. Sympathetic slows it down, parasympathetic speeds it all up. Okay, and so we'll refer to that as we get through this chapter. Okay, there's also a type of movement within an organ called segmentation. Your book talks about it. I won't test you on it, but that's what you're seeing down here, where it's just kind of moving back and forth within an organ. But if it's moving from one organ to another, it's through this action of peristalsis. Okay, but that has to do with the smooth muscle in the wall. Okay. All right, and so like I said, we're going to start at the top and go down to the bottom. Okay, and we're going to start with the mouth. The lining of your mouth is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Keratinized stratified squamous is, of course, the epidermis of your skin, but this is non-keratinized, lining your mouth and your lips, so it's very protective. Not as much as on the skin, but it's still very protective because it's so thick. Within the mouth are several features like your tongue. That's skeletal muscle. You do have conscious control over your tongue. Um, and underneath the tongue, if you look in the mirror today, hold your tongue up. There's this little fold underneath it called the frenulum that holds it to the floor. Um, and then you already learned about the papillae on the tongue and the taste buds associated with the papillae. The back of the tongue is held in place by your hyoid bone. You may not know that, but the hyoid bone. And then tonsils are lymphatic organs. You have different sets of tonsils. I've talked about these with you when we did respiratory system, but the lingual tonsils are actually on the tongue itself. Okay, stay here on this page. You can see the palatine tonsils here. You don't see the lingual tonsils because they're way down behind at the back of the tongue. Here you can see a frenulum. You have other frenula, like you've got one there connecting from the gums through the vestibule to the lips. But anyway, if you look at the roof of the mouth is called the palate. Part of it has bone within it. That's called the hard palate. Soft palate is posterior to that. It's more muscular. And at the tip of the soft palate, that little thing that hangs down there at the back of your mouth, that's the uvula. Okay. On there, if you see the tongue to its completion, all the way at the back, you can see the lingual tonsils. And then if you look at this sectioned view, here you really can see the difference in the hard and the soft palate. See, the hard palate has some bone here, but the soft palate is all muscular. And the uvula is part of the soft palate. It's just that little extension. When you swallow, we learned last time in respiratory system that when you swallow, the thyroid cartilage, the larynx, moves up, and that closes off the opening into your trachea. But another thing that happens is the soft palate moves up to close off the opening into the nasopharynx so that what you swallow doesn't go up. Okay. If someone is born with a cleft palate, that's where there's an opening within, usually it's in the hard palate, and so when that baby takes in milk, it can get up into the nasal cavity, which can be real dangerous. So they have surgery that can correct that these days, but that's what a cleft palate is. A cleft lip is when there's an opening at the front of the maxilla bone. It may be bilateral on both sides. All of that, your head features embryonically start off at the side of your head and grow together. And sometimes with the cleft, they don't come together completely, like at the roof of your mouth or at the front of your jaw. But anyway, all right, then you see the tongue. It's always real surprising how big it is, isn't it? All right. The other tonsils, we've already talked about lingual, palatine tonsils, and then those are the pharyngeal tonsils up in the nasopharynx. Okay. Then if we look at teeth, they're involved in mechanical breakdown. And you do have 4 different kinds of teeth, and you need to be able to identify these, and I want you to know how many of each type you have. Okay. The incisors are the ones at the front. So if you look at this picture, on each side of each jaw, you have 2 incisors, and they're just for biting off pieces of food. Animals that are herbivores, like rabbits, have humongous incisors because they just chomp down and bite that plant, and it's tough. Think about celery. You know, when you bite celery, you usually bite it at the front teeth, right? It's real tough. The incisors help with that. And then the canines, you have 1 of those, so there's a canine on each side of each jaw, so a total of 4 in the mouth. Canines are also called cuspids, so those are the eye teeth. Animals who are carnivores have humongous canines, like dogs, okay, and they tear flesh. And then the premolars or bicuspids, I'll just put P for premolars. You have 2 of those on each side of each jaw, and they're designed more for grinding. And then the molars, you have 3 of those if you have a complete set on each side of each jaw. Your wisdom teeth would be the 3rd set of molars. And you are an omnivore, and so your teeth shapes are a little bit different than a carnivore or an herbivore. Like if you think about your dogs and cats, they're carnivores. Think about their molars. They're real jagged, much more so than yours, right? And so they don't use them as much for grinding as they do tearing, but you know, your dogs don't chew their food, do they? They get it small enough to swallow real quick. They don't let it sit there for any length of time. But if you have a horse, horses' molars are super flat, aren't they? And when they chew, I believe it's not up and down, it's more like this. They're grinding. It's almost like they've been sanded. And yours are kind of in between the two. But anyway, each side of each jaw, you need to know how many of those you have and what they're for. So in an adult set of teeth, your permanent teeth, you have a total of 32. Okay, if you add all up. Now, in the baby's teeth, or the primary teeth, which are sometimes called deciduous, not by the common person, deciduous tooth, but have you ever heard of a deciduous tree? If I told you that a pecan tree was a deciduous tree, a maple tree is a deciduous tree, but a magnolia tree is not a deciduous tree. One thing magnolia trees do is hang on to their leaves all year long, whereas the deciduous trees drop their leaves in the fall, don't they? All at one time. Okay, so do you see why the primary teeth are called deciduous? They fall out. Okay. You don't have as many of those. If you have a full set of primary teeth, you don't have 32, you only have 20, because that child's jaw is not big enough to accommodate all 32. So with your deciduous set, you have on each side of each jaw 2 incisors and 1 canine, just like with the permanent set, but you don't have any premolars. And instead of 3 molars, you only have 2. So that's a total of 20. Okay. When that baby tooth falls out, it's not being pushed by the incoming tooth. It falls out because it loses its roots. And there are cells that reabsorb those roots or resorb them. They're called odontoclasts. That sounds like osteoclast, doesn't it? Doesn't that break down bone? Odontoclasts break down tooth roots. And so as they do their job, then each of the teeth loses its anchor, and so the incoming teeth then can come in. All right. So on this picture, would this be a child or an adult? A child. Do you see all these are primary teeth, but you see these secondary teeth that are forming? And look at the roots on the baby teeth, the primary teeth. They're huge, aren't they? But if you look at any child when their teeth just fall out, not when they go to a dentist and get them pulled, but when they just fall out on their own, they don't have any roots, do they? That's interesting to me. All right. If we look at the structure of a tooth, everything above the gum line is called the crown. Everything below the gum line is called the root. And then if we look at a sectioned view, here you can see the parts of the different layers within the tooth. So let's look at a picture and we'll see all these terms. The gum itself, your gum is called the gingiva. So if you have an inflammation of your gums, that's called gingivitis. You've heard of that possibly. But there you see the crown, here you see the root, and then on the sectioned view, the white part of the tooth that covers the crown is called the enamel, and it's the hardest substance in the body. It's made up totally of salts, but they're packed super tight, and it's harder than those salts that are in bone, and it's packed much more tightly. And there are no cells within it, so enamel is not living like bone is. Okay, and so because there are no cells, it doesn't replace itself. So if it gets broken down by bacterial action, eating food that's left on your teeth, then you can't replace it. The dentin is the part of the tooth that's most like bone. So it actually has cells that reside in little, I guess, I don't know if they're called odonto or little lacunae, but the cells themselves reside probably in little cavities, and then it's bone-like material around them. So the dentin is the living part. It's hard, like bone is, but it's the living part of the tooth. And then what nourishes the cells in the dentin would be the blood vessels, and then the nerve fibers interact with that are in the root and the pulp cavity. The pulp cavity is just the upper part of the root of the tooth. Excuse me, the root canal. Here's the root canal. So it's got all the blood vessels, nerve fibers in it. If you see like this would be like one of your cuspids or canines. If you looked at, say, a molar, a sectioned view of it, let's say if here's the gum line and there's the tooth, you know, the classic look of the tooth. You see the two roots there. And then if I did the root, let's say there's the crown, okay, and then here's the root canal, and then the upper part expands. And so on this tooth, this would be the pulp cavity right there. So it's just the upper part. Okay. If you have a procedure done called the root canal, that's when they remove all of the blood vessels and nerves from the pulp cavity and the root canal of the tooth. And so do you see how over time the cells in the dentin are going to die because they don't have nourishment? But because the rest of it is so bone-like, that can last for decades without causing you any problem. Okay, so it can last the rest of your life and be hard and give you the support that you need with the tooth. On the outer part of the root is an anchoring material called the cementum, and then the outside of that is a fibrous little connection, kind of like suture lines in your skull, but it's called the periodontal ligament. It's another type of immovable joint. It's one we learned in A&P1 called a gomphosis, but that's that periodontal ligament. Okay, so there's a lot of parts to the tooth. All right, in your mouth, you have a fluid, and that fluid is called saliva, and it's produced by various glands that are surrounding your mouth. Those are called salivary glands. You've got a bunch of little tiny, almost microscopic ones, but then you have three main pairs of salivary glands, and you need to name those of the large ones. The largest salivary gland of all is called the parotid gland. Let's look at it on a picture, and then we'll come back to the functions. Here you can see it. It's on the side of your head, right in front of and below your ear. If you've ever heard of an old childhood disease that people don't get anymore because now there's a vaccine for it, called the mumps. The mumps was a viral infection of the parotid glands. They were horrible. When I was a little girl, we all got the mumps. It was the worst of all those little childhood measles, mumps, chickenpox. Mumps was by far the worst. I still remember the pain of the mumps. Hurt really bad. It would swell up. And it's awful. But anyway, it affects the ear, obviously. But that's the largest salivary gland. You see how there's a duct that empties into the oral cavity? You don't have to name the ducts. And then underneath the tongue is the sublingual salivary gland. And it has little tiny ducts that empty onto the floor of the mouth. And then just under, if you hold your head up and fill your jaw and go in just a little bit, just under, at the very top of your neck, up under your mouth, you'll feel your submandibular glands. Do you feel those? Okay, and here's one. And they empty into the sublinguals. So if you press on them, or if you try to find your parotid glands, if you press on the side of your face just in front of the lower part of your ear, your mouth starts to water. And so that's saliva rushing into your mouth. Okay. All right, so you might wonder, why do you have saliva? There's a lot of reasons for it. First of all, it cleanses and moistens the mouth, so that helps flush away bacteria and other pathogens that might be there. But another thing it does is dissolve your food. Do you remember that molecules will not bind to taste buds unless they're dissolved? Okay, so it's got to have a watery medium to it for the dissolving of the food. But dissolving the food is a type of mechanical digestion. It's making it in smaller pieces. It's not chemically changing it. It's just putting it in smaller pieces. All right, it lubricates the food so it's easier to swallow, because in the salivary glands you have mucus cells that produce the mucus. You have serous cells that produce water. and that water can be used to dissolve the food. Um, the serous cells are also involved in producing an enzyme. Okay, and so here's our first enzyme in the digestive tract. It's called salivary amylase. If you were in a biochemistry class and you saw a term that ended in ASE, you would assume that's an enzyme. Most enzyme names end in ASE. What amylases do, they catalyze the breakdown of a starch molecule into disaccharides. So it's starting the process of carbohydrate digestion. The final process of carbohydrate digestion will be to get the disaccharides down to monosaccharides, which are small enough to be absorbed. But this starts carbohydrate digestion. So make sure you know that salivary amylase breaks down starches into disaccharides, into double sugars. Okay. So on your test, if I ask you which food group begins its chemical digestion in the mouth, you would say carbohydrates, and specifically it's starches. Okay. Today, when you get home, eat a cracker or something else loaded with starch and chew on it for a whole minute before you swallow it. It's going to start tasting sweet because disaccharides are sweet, like sugar. Your sugar in your sugar bowl is a disaccharide. Disaccharides are sweet tasting. And you can prove that, oh, I've got some chemical activity going on in the mouth, because it starts off as a starch and then it becomes a double sugar. And it's through the action of that enzyme. Okay, then this one where it says neutralizes the food. What is that ion called? Bicarbonate. We've learned that. We saw it in the blood. That's the main way carbon dioxide travels in the blood. But it's also very, 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 very important in the digestive tract because it can combine with hydrogen ions. And so when it combines with hydrogen ions, do you see how it lowers the hydrogen ion concentration, which in turn is going to raise the pH? Y'all get that? The more hydrogen ions, the more acidic, and the lower the pH number is. Remember, pH ranges from 0 to 7 to 14. And the lower the number, the more hydrogen. The higher the number, the less hydrogen and the more hydroxyl ions. Okay. All right. And so it's kind of backwards. The lower the number, like pH of 1 has more hydrogen ions than a pH of 7. Okay. We did that in A&P 1. Go back and look over it if you're confused. All right. Why do we worry about this? I said when it neutralizes food, that means it's going to raise the pH because it can combine with hydrogen. Most of the enzymes of your body work at a pH close to 7. Like in your blood, 7.4 is an ideal pH. Most enzymes work where it's slightly alkaline, like 7.3 to 7.5. Okay, and salivary amylase is one of those enzymes. A lot of the foods that we eat are acidic. So if you're eating some starches along with some other food groups that happen to be acidic, do you see how amylase will not be effective? Because the pH environment is wrong. And so that's why in your saliva and also in several other digestive juices, you're going to see bicarbonate ions. And every time in the digestive system you see bicarbonate ions, the function is to raise the pH so that the enzymes there will work. Okay? All right. So there you see on the left, that would be the parotid gland. And then this one is the sublingual. And this one is the submandibular gland. Okay. All right. And then here you're seeing those three glands under the microscope. And you see various clusters of cells. If you look at the one on the far right, the sublingual, the clusters, the cells, individual cells are much lighter in color, like this cluster right here. These are some of the mucus cells, and wherever you have the light ones, they produce mucus. If you have the dark ones like you see over here, those are serous cells, so they're producing more of the water and the enzymes. And then the submandibular's got a combination of the two. Okay. So you see some lighter mucus cells and darker serous cells. So you see mucus cells in here, serous cells there. But that's interesting. So each one of these glands produces different abundances of these different chemicals, which is not important on your test. I'm just showing this to you, okay? All right. I just want you to get, when I say serous secretion, it's a watery secretion, and that usually has the enzymes in it. A mucus secretion has mucus. Okay. Okay, so here we're done with the mouth. Now let's move to the pharynx. We've already learned the three parts of the pharynx in another unit, but there you can see them highlighted in different colors: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Really, as far as your digestive system is concerned, the nasopharynx is irrelevant, isn't it? Because food doesn't go there, right? Because that's above the soft palate. Right. But those are the three regions of it. And the pharynx is the area that initiates the swallowing mechanism. And the scientific word for swallowing, when you say it, it sounds like you're swallowing degglutination. Degglutination, that's swallowing. Your book gives a lot of emphasis to the mechanics of swallowing. Your test does not. Your notes do not. Okay? Just know swallowing is degglutination, but it starts at the pharynx. Okay? What you swallow is this lubricated ball of food. As you chew on that cracker for a minute, you will really appreciate the lubrication of the mucus. And what you're swallowing now technically is called a bolus, that lubricated ball of food. And it needs to have all that mucus on it, otherwise it would be too abrasive to the esophagus as it moves down. Okay. Some of the events that occur when you swallow: the soft palate rises up to close off the opening into the nasopharynx. The larynx moves up against the epiglottis, and then peristalsis begins. So that what you swallow does not go down into the trachea, instead it goes down into the esophagus. So the laryngopharynx leads to the esophagus, okay, which is our next organ. Okay, now we move through some of these. Some of these organs we move through real fast, okay, as your food does. So the esophagus, sometimes it's just called the food tube, but it runs down through your neck into your mediastinum, and then it actually penetrates the diaphragm. The opening in the diaphragm that it penetrates is called the esophageal hiatus. Okay, that's the diaphragm's opening there that the esophagus runs through. In the submucosa, it has some mucus glands. So we'll, under the microscope, when you look at it, you'll see some mucus glands. You see them a little bit. It's not really obvious here, but there they are. But under when we look at our microscope slides in lab, you'll see those easily. Now, a big deal to me is what epithelium makes up the mucosa, the inner lining of it, and this is the epithelium. Non-keratinized stratified squamous. Okay. Somebody tell me, just describe the look of stratified squamous under the microscope. Like, is it one cell layer, two cell layers? What is it? A lot of cell layers, and the ones at the surface are flat. That's why it's called stratified squamous, right? Because it is so many cell layers, nothing much can penetrate it, because there's too many cell layers for a pathogen to move through. All right, and that's the reason we have stratified squamous on our skin, but it's the keratinized type. That's the reason we have it lining our mouth. That's the reason you have it lining the ear canal. And every body opening you have has stratified squamous lining, because it's very protective. Its whole purpose in life is prevention of something going through it. Okay, even all the way down through the esophagus is lined with stratified squamous. So this is not one of the absorbing organs. Nothing is absorbed through the wall of the esophagus. just like nothing is absorbed at the wall of the mouth, okay, because it's stratified squamous. The structure makes sense, doesn't it? Okay. This is a very non-magnified view right here of the esophagus, so it's hard to see that that's a lot of cell layers. If we took that up in magnification, you'd see it. In fact, in A&P1, when you looked at the slide that was labeled stratified squamous, you were looking at the esophagus. You were looking at a non-keratinized slide. Okay, the next organ that the organ that the esophagus connects to on the lower end is the stomach, and the connection to the stomach is a sphincter muscle. And that sphincter muscle, sometimes the easy name is the lower esophageal sphincter, but it's a sphincter muscle, meaning it's a circular muscle, and when it's contracted, it closes off that opening. When it relaxes, that means something can move through it. The lower esophageal sphincter is also called the cardiac sphincter, simply because it sits at the top of the stomach, and the top of the stomach is called the cardiac region of the stomach. It has nothing to do with the heart. But if acids from the stomach move up through it into the esophagus, you have a condition called heartburn. Okay. People who have acid reflux, their cardiac sphincter is relaxed too much. And so acids from the stomach can get up and can literally eat away at the wall, the mucosa of the esophagus, and over time can cause serious damage. So that is not a disease to just take lightly. You need to do the things necessary, either the medication or the way you sleep or what you eat, to help prevent all those acids from moving up, because it is very dangerous, because it can literally eat away the wall of the esophagus, as we're going to see in a minute, because the stomach has a pH of like 2 as opposed to the mouth, which is the pH is closer to 7, in the esophagus. Okay. So there you see swallowing. I'm not, like I told you, you just need to know the soft palate rises up against the nasopharynx and all that, the little bit that I've written in your notes. Okay. Once you start to swallow, that initiates a peristaltic wave in the esophagus. And once it starts, it goes down. And as soon as it gets all the way down to the cardiac sphincter, that esophageal or that peristaltic wave causes the sphincter to relax so that what you swallow moves on in to the stomach. Okay. All right. So that's our next organ. Now we're going to spend a lot of time on the stomach. The food stays in the stomach quite a while compared to it staying in the mouth and certainly in the esophagus, because a lot of action occurs. We're going to have more chemical breakdown. We're going to have lots more dissolving, a little bit of absorption for things mostly that are already broken down enough, like water can be absorbed. Alcohol, some can be absorbed at the stomach because molecularly it is already small, kind of like a simple sugar. Some drugs have fast effects like aspirin because chemically they're small molecules, so they can be absorbed at the stomach. They don't have to wait a few hours to get to the small intestine. Okay. It still has all the 4 big layers, the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis mucosa, and the serosa. But in the muscularis mucosa, it has 3 rather than 2 layers, because the stomach is mixing in all different ways. So it has a 3rd layer that is longitudinal. So it has a circular, a 3rd layer that's oblique. That means diagonal. Oblique means diagonal. Okay? And so it can mix it all kinds of ways. And then if you opened up a stomach and looked at the inner lining, at the mucosa, it's real folded. It's just like a wrinkled piece of fabric, real folded. But if you put a lot of food in it, it will stretch out. And then when the stomach empties, it refolds in maybe another configuration. But those folds are called rugae. Ruga is singular. Rugae, or rugae, I guess. Okay. Then, here you can see some examples that shows you all the muscle layers. And then, I'm going to go to a picture. I know I've not talked about everything that was on that other slide, but I will as we look at these pictures. So here you can see the rugae. See all these folds in the wall? Um, the sphincter muscle right there is the cardiac sphincter or lower esophageal sphincter. This region of the stomach, this upper region that connects to the esophagus, is called the cardiac region. The part of it, this upper hump-like part, is the fundus or fundic region. The main part is the body. And then as it starts to narrow, that's the pyloric region. When it gets super narrow, it's the pyloric canal. I'm not going to ask that you distinguish between pyloric region and pyloric canal. Just know that pyloric is the lower end. And that's what connects to the small intestine. And duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. You can say that duodenum also. But we'll study that when we do small intestine. There's another sphincter muscle right here that controls the movement of the food from the stomach into the small intestine, and it's called the pyloric sphincter. So on the test, if I ask you, what does the food pass through as it goes from the esophagus to the stomach, you'd say cardiac sphincter. What controls the movement of the food from the stomach to the small intestine, you would say pyloric sphincter. Okay. All right, now, if we could take a really powerful magnifying glass and look at the surface of the mucosa, we would see tiny little openings in it, little microscopic openings in it that lead to tiny little microscopic glands within the mucosa. Those glands are called gastric glands, and the openings into them are called the gastric pits. Okay, so let's look at a picture of that. So here you see the mucosa of the stomach. And do you see these little openings here and here and here? Those are gastric pits. And they're leading into the gastric glands. The stomach's mucosa is fairly thick. It's got a lot of little gastric glands. And those glands produce the secretion of the stomach called gastric juice. Okay? And if you look at the surface of this, do you see how that simple columnar epithelium? If you went back to A&P1, this is very important to me, y'all. If you went back to A&P1 and looked at the function of simple columnar, the big one you have to learn is absorption. Doesn't that make sense that it's at the stomach? Because if simple columnar is there, that means something can move through it. And you have a little bit of absorption at the stomach. Okay? All right, so this is simple columnar. And then if you look down in the glands, you can see different kinds of cells. You can see some mucus cells. So they're going to produce mucus. That's one of the components of gastric juice. And then you see, especially at the bottom, but you also see some up in here. You see, well, those are mucus cells. You see these darker ones at the bottom. Those are called chief cells, which are analogous to the serous cells in a salivary gland. So they produce the watery secretion that has enzymes in it. And then there's parietal cells that secrete another component of gastric juice called hydrochloric acid. HCl is hydrochloric acid. Okay, and so I'm going to back up. Here you can see the three basic cells that are within the gastric glands. You have mucus cells, chief cells, and parietal cells. And then you have a water, you always have a water secretion in all these juices. But make sure you know chief cells produce enzymes. Parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid. Now, when you start reading in your book for stomach enzymes, you're going to come across two of them. But the only one I want you to learn is the one called pepsin. That's the old name for it. The new name is gastric protease, which is a better name actually because it tells you what food group it works on. What do you think? If it's proteases, proteins. So protein digestion actually begins at the stomach. But a weird thing about gastric protease is that it's one of the very few, if not the only, enzyme in the body that works at a pH real close to 1 or 2. So it won't work in a neutral pH environment. it only works at a pH really low. Okay, and that's the reason you need hydrochloric acid. Okay, because it drops the pH, and its presence then will activate the gastric protease so that it can work. So you're going to see several protein digesting enzymes in this chapter, and all of them tend to be fairly aggressive. That's how I like to describe them. Your book doesn't say that. But they're fairly aggressive, meaning they would break down the proteins in the cells that make them. So they all have to be released in an inactive form. And then something is going to activate them. The inactive form of pepsin is called pepsinogen. So it's released from the chief cells as pepsinogen, but as soon as it hits HCl, it gets activated into full-fledged pepsin. Okay? So on all of the enzymes that you're going to learn in this chapter, you have to learn at least two things. One is, where is it made? Two is, what food does it act on? But if it's a protein digesting enzyme, you got to learn a third thing, which is what activates it. Okay? And what activates the pepsinogen is hydrochloric acid. Okay? All right. So we've looked at a couple of enzymes. There's another enzyme at the stomach that your book talks about called gastric lipase. Guess what food group it works on? Don't write this down. Just answer my question. What food group do you think a lipase, Lipase, lipids, right. But it doesn't work well in an acidic environment. So even though it's released in gastric juice, it doesn't work till it gets later on in the digestive tract, till it moves somewhere else. Unless you just have an awful lot of fat in the foods that you eat, then it might work. So a little bit. So it's not super effective at the stomach. So that's why I don't want you to know that fats get broken down at the stomach. Okay, so far carbohydrates have started their digestion at the mouth, and then proteins start their digestion. It's not completed at the stomach, it just starts the process. So it doesn't absorb at the stomach. Proteins are not absorbed there. Okay, but there are some hormones that affect stomach action. The first one is called gastrin. Gastrin's actually released by the stomach cells, and it works at the stomach, but it has to get into little blood capillaries to go to the target cells of the stomach. But basically what it does is cause gastric juice to be secreted. Gastrin is released whenever anything moves into the stomach. You can actually start producing gastrin just by thinking about food. And your stomach starts gurgling. When you're hungry, you're thinking about food, your stomach starts gurgling. That's one phase of gastrin release. Your book gives a lot of effort to all the phases of gastrin release. You don't need to know that. Just know that it causes gastric juice secretion to increase whenever food gets there. Okay? And then this hormone you're going to get real familiar with. It has target cells all throughout the digestive tract. One of the places is in the stomach. But it's called cholecystokinin. In your book, in a lot of the diagrams, they abbreviate it as CCK, but it's cholecystokinin. It is made at the small intestine in the presence of fats and proteins. So as food moves from the stomach into the small intestine, the presence especially of the fats, I want you to memorize when fats enter the small intestine, because that'll help you figure out what its action is. Okay, have we broken down fats yet? No. We've started carbohydrate digestion in the mouth, protein digestion in the stomach. And so if you've got fats in the food you're eating, they haven't been broken down at all by the time they get to the small intestine, have they? And so their presence triggers cholecystokinin to be released. And cholecystokinin's function at the stomach is to slow down activity at the stomach. That's good. That prevents more stomach contents from getting in the small intestine to give the small intestine time to work on the fat, because that's where it's going to get broken down. So do you see how in a roundabout way If you know that it's the presence of fats that triggers cholecystokinin, that'll help you figure out what it does at the stomach. You want to slow down stomach activity. Okay, and then somatostatin is another hormone produced by the small intestine, and it also slows down especially the acid secretion at the stomach. So as you're studying, even though your book already has the charts for you, it might help you to make up your own little tables. One of enzymes, one of hormones, and just categorize them just to help you study, because it's easy to get them confused. The enzymes are not as hard. To me, the hormones are harder, because a lot of times enzyme names help you out. So, okay. All right. And then I haven't mentioned this word, chyme. It's pronounced like a K. Chyme. The end, E-N-D, end product of stomach digestion is chyme. The end product of mouth digestion is bolus. That's what you swallow. And then when that bolus gets into your stomach and mixes with all the gastric juice, it's kind of a pasty, semi-liquid, solidy substance, like vomit. That's chyme, okay? That's what chyme is. And that's what the food, its consistency is as it moves into the small intestine. There's a reflex that can kick in called the enterogastric reflex that limits the peristalsis in the stomach. If you already have chyme in the small intestine, there needs to be time for it to be processed, digested. And so through the enterogastric reflex, peristalsis slows down in the stomach. Okay? So that's a reflex that regulates how fast the stomach empties. And this picture is showing you that there's parasympathetic impulse involvement in all of that, which I'm not going to deal with. You just need to know parasympathetic speeds up stomach activity and all digestive activity. Okay, and this is showing you how the release of gastrin is controlled through that. See, just parasympathetic impulses can cause gastrin to be released too. I'm not going to go through this video. I'm sorry, we're kind of running short on time, and it goes into way more detail than I would ever test you on. Okay. All right, our next organ, we're going to get off of the digestive alimentary canal and now talk about some accessory organs, because the next place the food's going to go is the small intestine. And when it gets to the small intestine, it's going to receive some juices from some of these other accessory organs. One of those being the pancreas. Pancreas we already studied as an endocrine organ, so you know where it's located. But it also is an exocrine organ because it produces a juice called pancreatic juice. Do you remember the endocrine areas of the pancreas were called islets of Langerhans? Okay. And they were little kind of isolated little clusters of cells that were not affiliated with the ducts, D-U-C-T, of the pancreas. All right, but the cells that are connected to the ducts are little clusters called acini, and those are the ones that produce pancreatic juice, okay, the acini, or you can say acinar cells. Acinar. Okay, they produce pancreatic juice. Okay. So there you see the pancreas. Here you see the big ducts, the big pancreatic duct, and it has a couple of openings into the small intestine, but the main one is that one right there, and it's controlled. Its release is controlled by another sphincter muscle. There's a lot of sphincter muscles in this chapter. This one is called the sphincter. This is the old name that everybody still uses of Odie. We just kind of like that name, sphincter of Odie. The newer name is the hepatopancreatic sphincter, because bile from the liver also moves through there. Okay, hepato meaning liver. Okay, but the hepatopancreatic sphincter, or sphincter of Odie, that controls the movement for right now of the pancreatic juice into the small intestine. Okay, and so on the left picture, this would be in the pancreas. That's an islet of Langerhans, but all these little darker clusters, those are the acini. Okay. All right, so what's in pancreatic juice? Okay, a lot of enzymes are in pancreatic juice. Okay, the food is going to stay in the small intestine longer than it stays in the other organs we've seen so far, because more activity occurs there. A lot of enzyme action occurs. In fact, well, we hadn't. I'll get to that later. All right. So some these enzymes are. I know this looks horrible at first, but it's really not so bad. The first one, pancreatic amylase, because it's an amylase, it does just the same exact thing that the amylase in your mouth does. It's exactly the same chemical. It's just also produced at the pancreas. And it breaks starches down into disaccharides. So you might wonder, why do you need it? Why do you need it if you have it at the mouth? Well, the reason is you're swallowing all of that saliva from the mouth, and it then encounters the hydrochloric acid, which inactivates it. And so you got to have some more later on, because you don't break down the starches completely at the mouth into disaccharides. It doesn't stay there long enough. So you still have full-fledged starch by the time it gets, some of it, by the time it gets to the small intestine. Pancreatic lipase. Lipases break down fats. That's easy. And then these three, trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxylase, all of these break down proteins. You don't have to know what aspect of protein digestion they're involved in. Just know they break down proteins. And because they break down proteins, they're aggressive, so they got to get activated by something, because they start off as an inactive form, okay, as they're released. But then once they're released, they get activated. What activates trypsin is a protein that it's an enzyme that's actually produced by the small intestine called enterokinase. Don't confuse that with the enterogastric reflex. They're totally different. They just have entero, which means within. Enterokinase. Enterokinase is produced at the small intestine, and its function is to change trypsinogen into trypsin. Okay, and then once trypsin is activated, then its presence activates these other two, chymotrypsin and carboxypeptidase. Okay? All right, and then nucleases. You don't think about nucleic acids being in the foods that you eat, but they are. There's DNA and RNA, and you get some benefit from that. Some of that gets absorbed. But nucleases tend to break those down. Okay? And then the last thing I've put in bold print, not because it's more important, just because it's not an enzyme. Okay? Bicarbonate ions. Why do we have bicarbonate ions? To raise the pH. Okay? It raises the pH. Because every one of these enzymes listed here will not work at a pH of 2, which is what the chyme is as it's entering the small intestine. So the pH has to rise so that these enzymes can be effective. Okay? So it makes that chyme more alkaline. That means more basic, more higher, pH higher. And then some hormones that affect pancreatic juice secretion or release. The first one, let's go to the second one, cholecystokinin. We just saw that. Cholecystokinin was produced when fats entered the small intestine, right? And how it affected the stomach was it slowed down gastric activity, movement, and secretion of gastric juice, so that the fats could spend more time in the small intestine and not be washed through, so that they can be broken down. How cholecystokinin affects the pancreas is that it activates the cells that produce enzymes, one of those being lipases that work on fats, right? But also the enzymes that work on the proteins. You know, so that's why it's proteins and fats enter the small intestine. But anyway, so it activates those cells, the serous cells in there that are producing the enzymes. Secretin, its presence or it's released whenever acids, which acids are always in chyme because there's always hydrochloric acid, but it's triggered by the acid in the chyme, and because it's triggered by the acid, then it's going to cause the pancreas to produce the chemical that counteracts the acidity. Okay? So that'll help if you know the trigger for these. That'll help you figure out which cells in the pancreas they work on, okay, to counteract the trigger. Okay, and so this flow just shows you if this chyme coming in this is just showing you the secretin. The presence of the acids in there are going to cause, where's my number 2? There it is. Cause secretin to be released into the bloodstream that then goes to the pancreas and causes bicarbonate ions. We could do the same kind of flow with just the presence of the fats and the proteins in that, showing the cholecystokinin. Okay, next time we'll start with the liver and then we'll move on through the rest of the digestive tract.